Hi everyone. Today in this interview we have Sarah Monette, or as she's well known as well, Katherine Addison. For a lot of the Brazilian audience probably doesn't know you that much because I think your first book is going to be published here right now. So
Yep.
I'm going to be translating all these interviews. So this is an opportunity for a lot of Brazilian people get to know you. Like I think this is going to be up 1 week before the launch of your book here. So for those couple of Brazilian people that don't know you, but they are going to get to know you, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Sarah Monette. My pen name is Katherine Addison. I have written under both names, so that's a little confusing. I was born in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which was one of the 3 secret cities of the Manhattan Project in World War II. My dad was a nuclear scientist. I grew up there. I went to college in Cleveland, Ohio, Case Western Reserve University, where I majored in English and classics. So I have Latin and Greek and English, and was pretty good at French at one time, but I am not anymore. Not good at Latin and Greek anymore either, to be honest. And then I came to the University of Wisconsin at Madison to do my graduate work. So I have a master's and a PhD in English literature. My dissertation was on ghosts in revenge tragedy. So Hamlet's father was a big part of my dissertation. And then I spent several years writing full-time. And then I currently have a very small part-time job as the administrative assistant at my local public library. My books, my novels are fantasy. My short fiction tends to be horror. I like both. My novels also tend to have horror in them. I think of myself as a horror writer, first and foremost, but I don't think that horror and long form work very well together. So short form is horror, long form is fantasy. I have co-written some science fiction with my friend Elizabeth Bear, but I don't write it on my own. I don't have the right kind of brain. So I've written the book that just came out in English, The Tomb of Dragons, was my 13th novel.
I'm very happy that you're finally getting published here in Brazil. I've been hearing about the Goblin Emperor a bunch because I like to see what's coming outside as well. And I've read it in English because it's not here in Portuguese yet, but I'm gonna get the Brazilian copy as well because I really liked it. And so we can begin having a conversation. I usually do this thing, and I don't know if this is going to apply to you, but I like to do it with everyone so everybody feels comfortable. It's common in the middle of the interview that the person that I'm talking to, on occasion, they kind of slip in a curse word by accident, and they kind of feel all apologetic about it. So to make everybody feel comfortable, I like to begin telling people that you can curse as much as you want. There's not going to be an issue if it happens. And so we can all have a good time. I would like to know what's your most used curse word.
I say fuck a lot.
Fuck. Yeah, well, that's I think it's one of those curse words that you can use in a bunch of situations. So
yes,
that's a good one.
It can be every part of speech.
Yes. It could be a good fuck, a bad fuck, a bunch of it has a lot of meanings depending on the circumstances. So well, I you can say fuck as much as one. So for us to understand a bit of your history and how you got into the fantasy genre, I would like for you to tell us what was your gateway into the fantastic and fantasy and stuff like that. And if someone were to ask you a recommendation to begin in the fantastic, what would you recommend?
Okay, those are good questions. I honestly don't know what my gateway was, because some of my earliest memories are my father reading the Oz books to me, L. Frank Baum, so The Wizard of Oz, and then there's like there are 11 more by him, and then a lady named Ruth Plumley Thompson took over and wrote 20, 25 more, and then some other people also wrote more. I think there are still people writing. I think that's still going. I have lost track of it. But my father had, and I now have, the copies of the Oz books that his father read to him and his brother and sister when they were little. So I have those on my shelves, and I love them. My dad read them to my sister and me. So there is a lot of sort of family feeling bound up in those books. So, I was reading fantasy before I could read, basically. My father used to tell the story about one day when I was just barely 3. He was reading one of those books to me, and I said, "Daddy, that's not what the page says," because he was skipping. Alfred Baum wrote a lot of parades where he described everyone in the parade and what they were wearing and who they were riding and all the details. And Dad would just skip, because that's really boring for adults, not for little kids. And I caught him at it, which is how they learned that I could read.
So you learn early to read. You're advanced.
Yeah. Yep. I learned to read by being read to.
That's amazing.
Because nobody was trying to teach me to read at that.
It took me a while to learn how to read. I wasn't a bright kid. I had a lot of fun, but I wasn't bright. So, but I enjoy reading a lot now.
Yeah. Well, people come to it at different points in their lives. I just came to it really early.
And what age was that?
So that happened when I was 3. So I was reading, and I was, fully functional as a reader by 3. I read constantly throughout my childhood. I missed the bus home once because I was reading. And I was so wrapped up in my book that I completely missed the bus coming.
Well, so I think that you actually got a job that kind of suits you everything that you are. That's perfect, because if you had a different job and you enjoyed books as much as you do, maybe you wouldn't be so happy or fulfilled, I guess. And you said that people still write the Wizard of Oz and stuff like that, with Oz and everything. But do you think it's a good recommendation, like a suggestion for someone to begin in the fantasy?
I would, at this point, I would say not. They are dated. I mean, these are books that are written at the beginning, very beginning of the 20th century. And in some ways, they're not, they haven't kept up as well as they might. I think beginning in fantasy, a lot of people began with Harry Potter. I don't necessarily know that. I am not a big J.K. Rowling fan. So
me too.
It's not a recommendation that I would make, but it obviously was super successful.
Yes.
For millions of people. So,
and if you would recommend a fantasy book for an adult, what would you recommend?
Honestly, the person who came immediately to mind is actually a children's author, Diana Wynne Jones.
I don't know.
She was British. She wrote mostly children's books or young adult books, but her prose is really good. So if you're, trying to get your feet in a genre you're not familiar with, the prose isn't going to throw you for a loop, which, some other authors could.
Yeah.
China Mieville springs to mind as somebody whose prose is going to just tie you up in knots,
Yes.
whether you're familiar with fantasy or not.
Yeah.
So her prose is great. Her characters are great. Her worlds are always really interesting and not really, and not cookie cutter. She's not quite like anybody else I've ever read. But if you read her and you like her, you're going to like a lot of fantasy.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to look her up. I'm not familiar with her. I don't know if she's been published in Brazil, but I'm definitely gonna look her up. And there's something that I wanted to really ask you, because while doing my research, and you actually already said a bit of it, I was pretty amazed at your education, like everything that you studied, and well, especially the parts of the languages, because I saw a lot of it, even though you said that you're not as fluent or as you once were, but in your book, The Goblin Emperor, language is a big part of it. And
yes,
when I saw your education, the classic literature, theater, Renaissance theater, and I imagine a bunch of language, like you said, classic Greek, Latin, French, I see some points that maybe like an obvious connection to your work and now, but I would like you to elaborate, like, how does your college education relate to what you produce, and if there is a way that the college education helped you in a more unexpected way, less obvious.
Right. Yes. The very short answer is yes. Learning all those different languages, I was always interested in language. I was interested in the way in English, but as a kid, in the way that English could be put together and the things you can do with it. And then, learning French in high school and learning Latin and Greek in college and learning a little bit of Old English, Anglo-Saxon in my master's year. Just really emphasized a little bit of a tangent. In high school, I was really good at math. I took algebra, calculus, and then second year calculus, which is multivariable. I was great at it. Thought about being an English and math major. Went to college, took my first college math class. Could not understand anything. And it was the same second year calculus that I had taken the year before, but it was being taught in a completely different way. And I never got a grip on it. So I said, okay, not a math major. But I did find that translation, particularly of languages like Latin and Greek, where it's done, all of the conjugations and declensions and the parts of speech are done with endings on the words. Sort of, it felt like it was the same part of the brain that enjoyed calculus, enjoyed translation. So it was really, it was not easy, but it was enjoyable in some strange way. But that meant that I became really interested in fantasy that used language, like Tolkien. My grandmother gave me The Hobbit for the Christmas that I was 6. And my dad read it to me because that was what we did. And then he read me The Lord of the Rings. And I was just, I was fascinated with the way Tolkien used language. And of course, he was a philologist, and building language was what he did for fun. which, I am not at that level, but it was again, it was sort of looking at that and saying, oh, you can do that. So The Goblin Emperor was really the first book where I set out to make up a language. My first 4 books, the Doctrine of Labyrinths, which are published under my own name, have a lot of made up words in them, because I was trying to talk about things that there aren't words in English for, because they're things that aren't real in this world. So like magic concepts. Mm-hmm. You make up a word because it's a common thing for them. It's just not for us. But The Goblin Emperor was where I really sort of set out to talk about language and how language affects what you can and cannot say. So definitely the languages that I learned were immensely helpful in teaching me how to think about a language I was creating. It's also true. My academic training in theater and some community theater that I did as a performer as a teenager get into my work in a lot of ways. One of the books of The Doctrine of Labyrinths, the 3rd book, has a lot of theater in it. And then my most recent books, Witness for the Dead, The Grief of Stones, and The Tomb of Dragons, which take place in the same universe as The Goblin Emperor. So they're related. They're not a sequel, but they're related. One of the characters is an opera director, an opera composer. And so the theater sort of came roaring back.
I actually, while I was doing my research, I also learned something about you that I thought it was very interesting, and that maybe your Brazilian fans are going to enjoy as well, because I think it's pretty unique that you have a lot of experience with horses, if I'm not mistaken, and I would like for you to tell us about what is it that you do with them, what's your relationship with the horses, and if there's any situation in particular that your knowledge of horses has helped you as well writing something, because that's a very specific knowledge, I'm guessing.
A surprising number of fantasy authors actually are horse people. So as a child, as many little girls are, at least in America, I was horse crazy. I was, I loved horses. I wanted to read about all the books about horses I could find. I wanted to learn to ride horses. I did not live in a horse-heavy part of the United States. So it was not, I got some experience riding as a kid, but not very much. And then, I went to college and had umpteen thousand other things to think about and just sort of dropped out of my head. And then when I turned 35, a voice in the back of my head spoke up and said, "You want to learn to ride a horse?" I said, "I do." And it said, "Yes, you want to learn to ride a horse." And I said, "Okay." And I did it. I did some Googling, and I found there was a barn. The part of America I live in now is quite horse heavy. So there's a barn 15 minutes from my house, which I went. I called the owner. I said, "Can I come watch a lesson and see what all you do?" And she said, "Sure." So I went out. It was February. It was bitterly cold. We were all muffled, hats and gloves and scarves and coats, and just freezing. But I watched her teach a dressage lesson. Dressage is the in the Olympics, there's the show jumping, which is very exciting, and there's the eventing, which is very exciting, and then there's the competitions where it looks like the horse is just going in circles, and that's dressage, which is it's very hard to see what's going on unless you are actually a dressage rider yourself, because it's all very subtle, unless something goes spectacularly wrong. It's not fun at all. But she was teaching dressage, which meant that I could see the connection between what she was saying to do and what the rider was doing and what the horse was doing. And I said, I want to do that because that is fantastic. So I started in 2010. So I've been writing for most of 15 years. I'm an okay dressage writer. I'm not great, which is fine. I don't have to be great to really enjoy it. There's once you get past the basic competence of here's the horse, here's the reins, here's the stirrups, don't fall off. Basically, everything you do is going to be enjoyable to some degree. But so it's dressage is about getting the horse to change gait, change direction, tempo, all of these variables with as little movement as possible. You don't want to look like the rider is doing anything, when of course the rider is frantically doing 5,000 things at once.
Actually, when I was doing research, I saw that, and I saw the word in English, dressage, and I went to a translator, and it said the translation was training, and I knew it wasn't accurate, and that's why I asked, because I know that you're not necessarily training. It's a very specific form, and
right.
That made me wonder. Actually, it's two things. One that I already asked you, and another one. Have you ever? Has it helped you to write? And second, have you ever read something about horses that you knew it was wrong because of your experience with horses?
Yes. So I have not written very much about horses. There is a horse in The Goblin Emperor who's near the end, and it's not a big part, but it's important. I keep hoping that I'll have an idea that will let me write more about horses, because I think they're I think that dressage is very interesting because I'm a dressage nerd, but I also think that horses as people are very interesting. They're interesting people. They're not like human beings. They're prey animals. They're 10 times our size, but they think everything is going to eat them. I had my first horse spooked at tree stumps. I was like, really? It's like, yes, tree stump. We'll eat. We'll jump out and eat me. I swear it's true. And, we had a lot of conversations like that about whether or not this terrifying thing he had identified was actually terrifying. So they have a sense of humor, which is one of the things that very few writers actually can convey, because it's not something that you expect, and it's not something. I mean, horses think it's hilarious. So the first thing you do when you go out to ride, you get your horse you find your horse wherever he is and bring him to the cross ties, which are, which hook onto the halter and between the halter and the walls so that the horse isn't going to go anywhere without permission. And then you start grooming. And the first thing you do when you groom is you clean out the feet. So, because their feet have, horses with shoes, they're obviously between the shoe and the foot, dirt is going to collect. So all horses who have any kind of training have been taught how to pick, what the cue is to pick up their foot so that you can get at the bottom, so that you, the rider, can get at the bottom of it, which is what you want. And horses think it is hilarious to pretend that they have forgotten that cue. You ask the horse to pick up his foot, and he's like, "You what now?" And you ask again, and he's like, "Lady, no habla your language. I don't know what you want." And you're like, "Dude, you understood this yesterday. I'm pretty sure you understand it today." And you can go several iterations before the horse will give in and say, "Oh, that's what you meant. Why didn't you say so?" And picks up his foot.
Yeah, I would guess that that's a very specific knowledge that only by having a lot of interaction with horses, you might pick up on that. Yeah, that's a very... I don't think many people know that. I didn't know that. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people that are going to hear that, they're going to be surprised a lot. Because I don't think that... Well, I know that... Well, obviously, there's a lot of people here in Brazil that also ride horses and... But probably not a lot of nerds. So I'm guessing that my audience doesn't have a lot of horse riding people. But maybe they will after they hear you talking about because you make them sound like more interesting than I would be. Like, I've heard people talk about them, so that's something great. And so we can talk a lot about your book now, because that's something that really gets me. I'm gonna do something that I don't think you're going to enjoy, because I've actually seen you said that you're not good at synopsis, but I would like for you to brief, very fast introduction to your book, if possible.
Okay. So, the easiest way to do it is actually to combine it with another question, which is, where did you get the idea? This was right when the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies came out. So I think I'd just seen Fellowship of the Ring with Rivendell and Elrond and Arwen, and this amazing vision of what elves are like. And so I was thinking about elves. And then for some reason that I now no longer remember, I was thinking about airships. And I said, I want to write something that has elves and airships. I don't want to choose between the two. And then, because my brain works the way it does, I thought of the wreck of the Hindenburg. So, elves, airships, horrible fiery airship crash. And said, okay, that's a place to start, but why is it important? Why is it going to matter to my characters? And so obviously, big stakes. The Emperor was on board. Oh boy. How is that relevant to my characters? Well, what if my protagonist is the youngest son of the Emperor, who, because his mother was in an arranged marriage with the Emperor because she was a goblin and was not expected to have children, right? But did. And the Emperor hated them both and exiled them. And so he spent his entire life in exile. He's never been to the court. He's not expected to do anything. But his father and his 3 older brothers are all killed in this crash. And suddenly he's the Emperor. And that's really, that's where the book starts. And that's really what it's about, is about this 18-year-old kid who has no training, no experience, and no knowledge of how to survive in a court that was very intentionally modeled on Louis XIV's court at Versailles. how is he going to survive? How is he going to govern? How is he going to not let his power corrupt him? And that's really, and the book was really just me following him through the sort of the step by step after he gets the letter that says, "Hey, you're emperor." What decisions does he make from there? Okay, those decisions create new situations that require new decisions. What decision does he make? That creates a new situation, and it just keeps going.
Wow.
And that was really how I wrote it.
Well, I'm gonna, before anything, I would like to say that you actually made a very good synopsis. So I think that you don't have to worry about it. You're good at it. That was a very good synopsis. I think you got the big topics like for people to get their attention. So congratulations.
Yep.
While doing my research, I came across a quote of yours that I thought it was interesting, especially talking about this book. You said, and I quote, "As a reader, I'm easily bored by realism. Given the choice, I will always pick the story that promises to explore beyond the limits of the everyday." I don't know if you remember that quote in particular, but I thought it was pretty interesting because even though The Goblin Emperor is a fantasy and one of my favorite fantasies now, I think that it's very grounded. It's not a fantasy like an epic with destruction and war. It's actually a fantasy about, like you said, an unfortunate circumstances and how this character Maya deals with it. And
Yep.
well, the story tackles also such sensitive themes like abandonment, father-son relationship, prejudice, and stuff like that. So even though it's a fantasy book, it revolves around real world stuff, real world issues. So putting that with the fact that you prefer books that realism bores you, I was wondering, well, how or why would you choose the fantasy setup to talk about such real world stuff?
That is a good question. Part of the answer is that when I was thinking of, in my PhD work, I was trained as a genre theorist. So I'm really interested in questions of genre and how books, which is basically books are in a big conversation, and how they relate together is how you put them together in genres. So I was thinking, and I think it was 2005, while I was thinking about elves, I was also thinking about the fantasy genre. And I was thinking that while I love a good quest fantasy and saving the world and all of those things, if we want fantasy to survive and continue to be a living genre, it has to learn some new tricks. There's only so many times.
Yes.
You can take the ring to Mordor. And so I was really interested in writing a fantasy that didn't go anywhere. That wasn't about, my first 4 books are not a quest per se, but the characters spend almost all their time going back and forth and up and down, and geez, it's very tiring.
Yes.
And so I set out really deliberately to write a fantasy that didn't go anywhere. So once Maya gets to the court, he does not leave the court. And having done that, I sort of boxed myself in with, I can't get away from questions of politics, which I also hate writing about.
Well, but you're very good at it. Well,
thank you. I never intend to do it. And then I look back at what I've done and I'm like, oh, geez, that's all politics.
yeah. Well, actually, I'm gonna just interrupt you briefly because that relates a lot with my next question. Because while I was reading your book, I have to confess, I have particular frustration with Game of Thrones. It's not that I don't enjoy the books, but
Mhm.
as a political science student myself, that's what I study.
Mhm.
I really dislike how usually fantasy portrays politics, because they tend to
Yep.
focus on the betrayal and the violence. And even though politics do have that, it's a small part of politics. But I
Yeah.
think it's the easiest part of politics, the one that entertain us the most. But
Right.
it's not real politics. And your book does something that I think it's amazing. And I honestly, when I was reading, I couldn't believe that I was reading that, because your book stand out because you emphasize a lot. First, bureaucracy, the symbolic struggles for, like, for example, etiquette, language, fashion, colors, the right way
Yep.
to move, and that stuff. It's more politics than violence most of, and well, actually that's some type of violence as well, because that's how usually the government, the powers to be, they define who is who by the
Yep.
traditions and the behavior of everyone
Yep.
around someone. So when you have someone becomes the president, there's a lot of etiquette and tradition and fashion and a bunch of stuff that
Yes.
make power has violence, and you need guns and bullets and stuff like that, but you also need symbolism, and your book, it's masterful at doing that. So that's one thing that I really wanted you to elaborate while we dialogue with the other question is, why do you choose it? And now, knowing that you don't like to write politics, why do you did you choose to do that so well? And well, did you know all that stuff already? Did a specific researches? Because it was, I'm gonna have to say, it's probably the most politics fantasy that I've ever read. And people are gonna think, no, Game of Thrones. No, Game of Thrones is very good. I enjoy Game of Thrones. It's fine if you like it, but that's not politics. That's other things. But anyway, I diverge. How did you came about to build this world with such a real sense of what politics actually is?
Well, I think that it's largely because of all the reading I had done about the courts of Elizabeth and James in the English Renaissance. Obviously, this is the time period that I specialize in. I did a lot of reading about, mostly from the perspective of theater, and the idea of the court mask, which is this very elaborate drama that exists primarily in order to give the ladies of the court an excuse to dress up in costumes and dance. It has other purposes as well, and the people who wrote them often used them for other things, but that's their originating purpose is a vehicle for court ladies to dance, a vehicle for the sovereign king or queen to be praised. It's a way for the court to show a way for the court to hold up a mirror to itself and say, "Aren't we pretty?" Basically. So I know a lot about court masks, and I sort of working backwards from that, I know a fair amount about the way the courts of Elizabeth and James worked. I also was very interested in Elizabeth when I was younger, not before I started my PhD work, like when I was in my teens. And I read not a lot, but a fair amount about her and her life. And in fact, the other inspiration for Maya's situation, aside from getting there from the horrible fiery crash at the Hindenburg, was that's how very much how Elizabeth came to the throne. She was under house arrest, and because her sister hated her, her sister Mary, who was queen at the time, hated her. She was under house arrest, could at any point have been executed. And then one day they came and said, "Yeah, your sister's dead. You're queen now." And she was ready for it. She had spent her whole life in and out of court, in and out of favor, because Henry VIII played favorites with his children in a really horrible way. But so she had all of that training. She knew all of the rules, and she knew how to turn her trip from the house she was in, and I have blanked on the name, the country house she was in, to London, to the court. She knew how to turn that from just a journey into a progress, a royal progress from place to place. And she was like the first PR genius, I think. She really, really understood how to use her image to get what she wanted.
And
so I was thinking about her, but also just the thing about choosing this viewpoint character who doesn't know anything about the court is that you do have to describe it all, because he doesn't know. It's all new to him, and he's looking frantically for clues that will tell him how to act and what to say. So you have to really pay attention to all of those details, all of, what you were talking about, the clothes and the banners and the words. And yeah, I did not mean to do that to myself. And yet.
Well, but you did it masterfully. I that's something that I think that, well, it's missing in a lot of books. Good books. There are a lot of good books that get this specific part wrong, in my opinion. Well, you said something, and it caught my attention as well in the book, is because I would argue that most fantasy works, they tend to finish when the character becomes king, puts the crown, and sits in the throne. That is not the case with the Goblin Emperor. Actually, it's the first chapter, the first part, it's him becoming the emperor. He doesn't, the ceremony of the throne stuff, it happens a little bit later, but he becomes emperor right away. I was wondering why choose to begin like that first, and if you can think of another work that does that as well, because usually that's the goal, the end goal of the book. But I don't remember many books or movies or something that begin with that.
Well, that's exactly why I did it. Is because I didn't know of any fantasy books where you actually saw what it was like for the Scullery Boy to be the king. And it occurred to me in thinking about genre. As I was thinking about, we need to do different things. We need to try new things. That there are a lot of stories where the Scullery Boy becomes king. It's the Arthurian, or it goes back to the Arthurian legends, partly. But certainly, I think a lot of there's a big influence on Anglophone fantasy writers from that, and I can think of 3 off the top of my head. The fantasies, multi-volume fantasies that were about a boy who seems to be perfectly ordinary, who is actually secretly, right, this king, magical king. But yeah, they stopped.
Yeah, exactly. That's what. Once that's achieved, that we don't know if it was a good king or a bad king or anything at all. It's like it all went well, and we just have to assume, and that's pretty unique in your book. And actually, talking about Maya, that one, I would argue that one of the best parts of the book for me was being able to see the struggles inside Maya, because he constantly fights between the urge to do what he wants and to do what it's expected of the emperor to do. And he's always questioning himself and trying to read. And we know how he feels about stuff. And the choices. I was wondering because in many ways he's a unique character because he's not the warrior, he's not the mage, he's not like
Right.
a brilliant mastermind. He would
Right.
seem unremarkable to many people, but even though he would seem like that, he's an extremely powerful force for the narrative. His vulnerability makes us want to learn more through him. And
hmm
how do you approach crafting a character that it's at the same time vulnerable, but he's not dumb? Like because he's not the opposite of competent. He's not incompetent. He has
Right.
like some street smart, I would say, but I don't, because I don't know, maybe he learned to survive living in a precarious situation before the palace as well. But how do you measure? Well, he needs to be smart, but not too smart, and he needs to be vulnerable. But he can't be dumb because there's
Right.
not gonna be any story. So how do you measure the right place to put Maya in?
I mean, Maya's character sort of defined itself for me pretty early on. It's they're on, but they're on the airship. They're getting ready to go to the court, and or I think they're on their way. And the captain invites him to come forward.
The sunset, right?
And he does a little tiny social engineering thing to make sure that his hated and abusive cousin Sethris doesn't go with him. And he's very pleased about that. And then he thinks, I'd better not get used to that. Right? You think that could be really poisonous. And that for me was sort of the moment where I figured out who he was. Because he's somebody who has spent his entire life in relative poverty. His mother was wonderful, but she died when he was 7. He spent the last 11 years in the custody of a cousin who hates him and who is not above physical abuse, as we know, but who has also grudgingly been teaching him things like history and literature and some of the stuff he needs. Not all of the stuff he needs, but some of the stuff he needs. And so that's sort of his situation, but who he was inside of himself, that only became clear when he has this very, very self-aware moment about, I just did something that was very satisfying, but also kind of cruel. And that's not the guy I want to be. Which made him actually, in some ways, it was very helpful in writing him that he is that self-aware, because it meant that he was always processing the people's reactions to him. Which gave me a lot of leeway to show what the emperor is expected to do versus what the emperor ought to do, because those have become, under the last several emperors, those have gotten kind of divergent. So yeah, I mean, that balance was hard. It was hard. It was hard to maintain believably that he was believably that he was neither corrupted nor killed by the environment he found himself in. And that's, that was, but that also turned out to be kind of what the book was about. Yeah. It was about his not just learning how to survive in the court, but learning how to be the person he wants to be in the court, which is, someone who is fair and just and kind.
I think it's very accurate in the sense that someone a little bit less bright would have been killed pretty fast.
Yeah.
Or would have been like a puppet of someone.
Yes.
But someone that was too smart, there would be no story to tell because he would be like, it would be too easy for him. And you see Maya make mistakes, you see him reflect on his behavior, like you said. And there's a bunch of parts that he does that he takes decisions, and being able to read the dialogue inside of him, it's pretty good to make us feel, well, it makes sense that he's doing how he's doing.
Right.
And
right.
Another particular thing that the Goblin Emperor does that I think is pretty unique in the fantasy world is, like a bunch of fantasy books, you have gods, but the gods in this world are, I would argue, a lot more similar to our type of gods, that in the sense that they don't come here and do destruction, they don't give powers, they are more about like moral and tradition and customs and stuff like that. It's more related to our sense of faith and religion in a bunch of ways. It's a magical world, there's magic in it, but the relationship between the people and their gods is more similar to ours. And I thought that was interesting because during my research, I saw that you're an atheist. And that's, how did you develop such a nuanced portrait of faith and gods? And was a deliberate choice to make religion such a fundamental part of it? Because it's how do you as an atheist build this religion so well, and why would you choose to make it such an important part of your book?
Good. That's a really good question, and it's complicated. I want to start with a book recommendation, because you asked earlier if there were other books that thought about politics as this thing that isn't all betrayals and treachery and executions. Lois McMaster Bujold's The Curse of Chalion is very much about the kind of political negotiations that the Goblin Emperor is about.
I'm gonna look it up.
Yeah, it's an excellent book, and she was thinking about Spain, medieval and Renaissance Spain, and I had read that, I think, if I'm not getting my timeline mixed up. And her book is also about characters whose faith and religion is very, very important, but her gods do things in the world. So there's no question about whether they exist. They do, and we can see them at work. And I thought, and that's the way that most fantasy portrays religion, right? Is that the gods are objectively real. Most fantasy also tends to portray religion as in some ways corrupt, or, what's the word I want? Oppressive.
Yeah.
And so again, I was thinking about genre, and I thought it would be really interesting to write a world where the characters are very devout. They believe 100% in their gods, but there's no objective sign that the gods are real. And that's also something that comes back in the Cemeteries of Amalo, the trilogy that I just finished with the Tomb of Dragons. Will come back a lot. Is that the question of religion and the reality of the gods and faith. And I thought it would be really interesting to write a religion that works like our religions, where there is no objective proof of the existence of God. And so that was sort of where I started. And I set out, I sort of figured out who the gods were because I knew there were multiple gods. And I figured out a little bit of how the pantheistic system works in the empire. And, who you'd go to. So, like, Saivo is the goddess of rivers and water, but also the goddess of healing. So your healers are going to be clerics of Saivo. And Mira is the god of war. So anybody who's warrior-like is probably going to follow him. Just little lines of direction like that. And then, I world build, I make stuff up as I go along. Partly because one of the things that I really enjoy about writing is the discovery. I like surprises when I write. I like to discover things I had no idea were true. I found that if I work everything out in advance, I get bored. I've answered all the questions. Why am I writing this? So I didn't do any more than that kind of very minimal setup, and I started writing. And I don't remember exactly how it happened, but I realized quite early on that the court is kind of agnostic. But it's very fashionable to not really put your whole heart into believing in the gods. Nobody's an atheist yet, but everybody's sort of, whatever. You go to church, you go to the Othos Mira once a week for to be prayed at, and otherwise you're fine. All the holidays, you celebrate all the holidays, otherwise you're fine. Another thing I thought it would be interesting to put somebody into that setting for whom his religion is very powerful and very sort of fundamental to not only who he is, but how he copes. Which then, sort of folded back into one of the reasons Maya's religion is so important to him is that his mother was the one who taught him. So it's something that he still has of her. It's also his religion, his faith is very internal and very mystical. So, which is not the way that the worship of other gods doesn't work like that, but his worship does. And it was also something, I have a lot of quarrels with the way organized religion, particularly, though not exclusively, Christianity, has behaved over the last 2,000 years. Organized religion has done some horrible things. But I also know that a lot of individuals have, been sustained by their faith, have been, been made strong by their faith, have expressed their faith in ways that are amazingly beautiful, like Bach and Handel. And there's a whole slew of guys there, particularly Baroque music, but before and after as well, whose music is an expression of their faith. And I don't want to do without Bach. So I thought, it's not fair to always have religion be evil in fantasy, because that's not realistic either. That's not how it works in the only real life we know about, which is ours. So I did very consciously set out to write faith in a way that respected it.
I think you succeeded because, yeah, usually in fantasy, we know that there's gods and we know that we have people that worship them, but usually well, the traditions and the morals that people get from those gods, they tend to go the tyrant way, like the evil stuff, like very crappy stuff. And that's not the
Yep.
case with your book. That's a pretty realistic, again, like I would argue, depiction of a good religion or a good practitioner of the religion. And you said something that I was already wondering about world building. One element of the book that makes the narrative so immersive is how you convey the weight of the history of this world. The book constantly suggests that important events and figures uh,
Mhm.
existed before this story in particular, and that their
Right.
actions are have consequences till today. For
Right.
example, when you have Maya choosing his emperor name, he goes into his lineage, his father's lineage, and
Mhm.
talking about the grandfather and the great great grandfather. So, and not only that part, but we constantly have this thing that, well, stuff has happened here before. It doesn't start today. And
Right.
I was wondering if you, by any chance, have a collection of notes of this world that you built, because it seems like it makes a lot of sense. It's pretty well tight, in the sense that it's some stuff. For example, in the languages and stuff, it doesn't.
Yeah.
It carries weight. It has meaning to us as readers, and by I don't know. I know that the other books on this world, they don't relate to the events necessarily,
Mhm.
or the characters more specific of this book, but if you
Yeah.
just open the Goblin Emperor, immediately you feel like, well, this has a past, and the past matters. It's not like we're just throwing names around. So do you have that collection of notes of world building and stuff like that?
I do have to write things down. My memory is not that good. So I write things down when I think of them. I do have, and I don't know if it'll be in the Brazilian edition, but in the English edition, there is a glossary
A
of
big one.
people.
It's
Yeah, a big one.
huge. I think it's gonna be
And
in
that was
Brazil as well.
and that was from, that was the notes. Basically, it's a prettied up version of the notes that I had taken. I now have, having written 4 books and a novella in this world, I have a spreadsheet so that I can keep track of which characters appear in which books. And so that I can look them up and know who they are. Or I can say, I know that I invented a scholar of something or other, and I can look up scholar and find this person and whose name I've forgotten. So yes, I do have notes. They are generally kind of chaotic, but most of it is stuff that I wrote down after I invented it in the story. Some of it is stuff that I had to stop and sort of, pull back and go work out the exact lineage of emperors, from Maya back to his father, back to his father's father, and his father's father's father. And how I think I had to go back like 5 emperors to be sure that I knew what I was doing. And I think I think there was one afternoon where I just sort of made up a bunch of emperor names so I could put them in as I needed them. Yes. I mean, yes, I write everything down because I have learned that, and many writers I know say the same thing, that if you don't write it down, you cannot trust yourself to remember it. That the idea will be gone.
Yeah, and it's a lot of stuff, so I don't see any other way that you're gonna keep it all tied
Yeah.
together and stuff like that. Well,
Yeah.
now we're going towards the end of the interview, and because I don't like to take you writers to take so much of your time, because I know that you guys write a lot and it takes time to write, so I don't like to
Yes.
hang you here. But while we work to the end, I usually, when I interview people, I post it on Instagram and I open a box so people can ask you things. And
Sure.
I choose 3 of those questions and I talk to you about them. The first one that I'm gonna bring, it's actually from a dear friend of mine, Fabio Fernandes, and he is actually the person that translated your book here in Brazil. It's not published
Cool.
yet, but he is the translator of the Brazilian version, and he's actually a science fiction writer as well. And I know the answer, and I know that you already briefly talked about it, but he asked if we're gonna have other stories that go in the same universe as the Goblin Emperor.
So, yes, the Goblin Emperor itself is designed to be a standalone. The story is complete. But I wrote 3 books about one of the minor characters in the Goblin Emperor, Thara Kelahar, the Witness for the Dead, which are The Witness for the Dead, The Grief of Stones, and The Tomb of Dragons, which just came out like a week and a half ago, maybe. So there's those 3, and then I have written a novella called The Orb of Kairado, which takes place, which has it. The beginning of the story is the wreck of the Wisdom of Joharo, the airship that the Emperor died on. So it starts from the same place as the Goblin Emperor, but it's about completely different characters and is a completely separate story. And it was, it was in fact kind of a. The publisher approached me and asked me if I could write a novella set in this world, and I was in the middle of the Tomb of Dragons, and I was very tired of Amalo, which is the city that those 3 books take place in. Tired of Amalo and tired of these people, which is nothing against them. It's just that you spend a lot of time with characters when you write, especially when you write more than one book about them. You spend a lot of time with them. And it was really a relief to write a book that was just in a completely different place with completely different characters worrying about completely different things. So there's those 5 stories. There are 2 short stories, one of which, Min Zemarin's Plan, is actually available online in English on Sunday Morning Transport is the magazine. The other of which, Laura Selege, appeared in the paperback of The Witness for the Dead. And I need to ask my publisher if I can put it up on my website so people can read it, because that's been years now. Those are both short stories. They both take place in Amalo, so they're both sort of about the same people, the same ideas as the trilogy. They were both chances to see the main character from a different point of view, which is always fun. But that's what I've got so far.
Well, it's I really hope that those come to Brazil as well. And well, Marcos, he actually has a channel where he also talks about fantasy literature. It's called Toca do Aventureiro, or it will be Adventurous Layer, maybe. I think that will be the translation of his channel. He asked, and I thought it was a very fun question, what's the size of your library?
Yeah, I can't give you a solid number, but probably I mean, certainly upwards of 300 books in the house. Probably upwards of 500.
Well, you have a bunch of them. I would expect that from you.
My husband and I are both book accumulators. So,
well, and Juan asks, and I actually know the answer to this, but for the Brazilian fans, I think it makes sense if we talk about it. Juan asks, why did you start using the pen name Katherine Addison?
it is a good question. So, as I said earlier, my first 4 books, The Doctrine of Labyrinths, were written under my real name. The first book did really pretty well. It got a lot of good press. The publisher made a pretty hard push. It did quite well. But a thing happened that often happens in American publishing, which is that and I don't know why it keeps happening because they always do this and it never works, but the publisher says, oh, hey, the first book did so well, we don't need to publicize the second book because everyone will just buy it. Which is true. It's true for some percentage of the people who bought the first book, but not all the people who bought the first book. And certainly you're not going to get more people buying the second book than the first book if you don't push. So they did not push. And the book did not do as well as the first book. They had already, on the basis of the first book, signed me for another 2-book contract, which was the second 2 books in the quartet. And they continued to not push. So the third book didn't do as well as the second book. The fourth book didn't do as well as the third book. They took the second book out of print before the fourth book was published, which I'm still mad about. And then came and said, well, your numbers are terrible. Your sales numbers are terrible. We don't want another book from you. And at this point, the author feels like a kitten in a box on the side of the road. Free kittens. And it started to rain. So as a kitten, you're in the box by the side of the road. It's raining. And you're sort of looking around going, oh, well, hello, anyone? And as it happened, my current publisher came along and said, we really want to publish you. Great. But this was when American publishers were selling principally to the 2 major chains, which were Borders and Barnes & Noble. Barnes & Noble is still around. Borders has gone under. This is in 2009. So it's before the big surge of indie authors, self-published authors. It's all still, it's all still traditional publishing, and traditional publishing is all selling to these 2 big buyers. And the first thing that happens when the people from the publisher go to talk to the people from the bookstores is that the people from the bookstores put the author's name into the computer. And the computer comes up with numbers. And in this case, my name is going to bring up terrible numbers. And nobody is going to buy the book. But they said, if you take a pen name, even if everyone in the room knows that it is a pen name and knows who it is a pen name for, when they put the pen name in the computer, no bad numbers come back. And they buy your book. And so that is what we did.
Well, now the Brazilian fans will know as well why you have the name Katherine Addison, as well as Sarah Monette. They're both the same person. Well, so we can finish this off. I like to have this dynamic where I will ask you questions. You don't have to justify any of them. You can just straightforward answer. If you have the need to elaborate on it, feel free to do so. If you don't want to, that's fine as well. Okay. Name one author, dead or alive, that you would like to have coffee or tea with?
Well, I mean, the first person who comes to mind is my friend Elizabeth Bear, who is a great science fiction writer. I say in an entire lack of bias. We have been friends for 20 years. She's delightful to talk to, and I don't get to talk to her nearly enough because we live half a continent apart. I would also really love to have coffee with Ursula K. Le Guin.
That's my answer.
Just
all the time.
yes.
I'm a huge fan. One fictional character that you would like to do the same.
Oh, okay, yes. Antrig Windrose from Barbara Hambly's books.
I'm not familiar. What are the names of the books? So we can look.
Okay, Barbara Hambly, Hambly. These specific books are The Silent Tower, The Silicon Mage, and Dog Wizard. They are. It's a portal fantasy. So a young woman from our world ends up in another world. But there's actually a lot of play back and forth between worlds, which is between our world and their world, which is very interesting. She has a history degree, and so as another person that I learned to think about the history of my world. Antrig is a wizard. He's extremely well learned. He's absent-minded. He's very funny. I love him. So yes, that's my answer.
I'll look it up after the interview finished.
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings or Narnia?
Lord of the Rings.
Star Trek or Doctor Who?
Actually, I'd have to go with Doctor Who.
Star Wars or Dune?
Star Wars.
Alien or Predator?
Alien.
Blade Runner or The Terminator?
Ooh. Yeah, The Terminator. But that was hard.
Well, Katherine or Sarah, wherever, you will prefer. Thank you so much for agreeing to this interview. It was amazing for me to have this opportunity to talk to you, to get to know you better. I'm very excited that your book is getting here in Brazil. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people are going to love it. I think it's right at the alley that a lot of people in the Instagram and YouTube sphere are enjoying right now here. So I'm very excited to hear a lot of people's opinion on it. So we can finish this off. I would like for you to send some words for your Brazilian fans and soon to be more Brazilian fans.
Yeah. Thank you. Which I think is the thing that all authors should say to their fans often. Because, you can write stories all you want, but if you don't have anyone to read them, yeah, it's important. It's important to have someone to read what you write. And I love people who read. I love people who read, full stop. I also love people who read my books. And I hope that people in Brazil find this book appealing.
I'm sure they will. And you can always count on me and a bunch of Brazilian people to read your stuff as soon as it gets published here. I hope that everyone listening enjoyed it as well. And see you next time, and take care. Bye-bye.